Everyone, I hope you're all well today. Thank you for joining me. Just wanted to share with you then, myself and my family have been away this past week for a few days. We went down to a family-based holiday park, and I'd booked this particular place due to the fact that it didn't have the old CV plastered all over its website, and I'd spoke to them beforehand, explained that neither myself nor my partner would be wearing a mask whilst on the park. I didn't want this to be an issue, and I certainly did not want to be prompted continually on this in the presence of my children. So there was no issues there, lots of reassurance, so it's all good. Get down there. First morning we go to a pre-booked craft activity, and it soon becomes quite clear that myself and my partner are the only ones in there amongst this group of families without a face mask on, which was fine, But then I noticed the lady about to run the group also has a face mask on. So I'm looking and I'm thinking, she is surely going to drop the mask before interacting with the children. And of course she doesn't. So I then, when she did come over to our table, to interact with my children, I did politely ask her, and to be fair, I said, if you're comfortable in doing so, please would you mind just dropping your mask when you're talking to my kids. So she was fine, she was great, no problem, didn't have an issue with it, and dropped the mask, and it's all good. And I did actually go over to this lady a short while afterwards. I wanted to make sure she didn't feel awkward and that she sort of understood where I was coming from. So I did provide her with a bit more of my perspective and my concerns and my understanding in relation to the psychological impact of interaction with a covered face. So, she was lovely, she seemed really open to this, but it was quite clear for me that she perhaps hasn't considered this until this point, and it certainly did not seem to be at the forefront of her mind. She was very much of the premise that she was just following orders, that she was doing what she had to do to keep her job, and actually she was quite forthcoming in telling me that if it was down to personal choice, she and many of her colleagues, she believed, would not be wearing a mask. And actually, she didn't understand why she had to. She simply knew that she had to, or thought that she had to, in order to keep a job. So upon her telling me that all these activities for the children were being led in this way, I take myself down to management, spoke to a lady there, asked her for a policy, asked her for a risk assessment, looking into the psychological impact of the mask wearing. She seemed quite shocked at this, she seemed quite confused, and actually this lady turned around and asked me a question, and it really has stuck with me, this question. She asked me, what is your issue with your children being around people with masks on? And the reason it stuck with me is because it sort of affirmed to me that many people either don't have this understanding or just aren't considering the psychological impact of the mask wearing at the minute. Not only for our children and what they're absorbing, but also for our vulnerable adults. And also for all of us, really, on a psychological level, I do believe this is having an impact on all of us. But in focus on our children, for the past 8 months, the fact is our children have faced a complete upheaval of what they once knew to be normal life. They have faced significant changes to their sense of routine, to their sense of structure, to their sense of consistency. And all of these constructs and understandings actually contribute massively to a child's sense of well-being, to their sense of security and safety and purpose and belonging and control of their lives. It all contributes to that. So actually when there are changes to the consistency and to the structure in a child's life, it can be very disruptive to their emotional and intellectual well-being. On top of this, our children have also faced significant disruption to their socialisation. Obviously, many children faced the closure of the schools at the time, the closure of other social platforms, social groups, play centres, playgrounds, all these places, these settings where they could once previously come together and interact with others and share and play and be creative with one another. This was totally disrupted, which I believe for many children would have affected friendships and perhaps forming friendships and attachments, and perhaps they haven't seen relatives that they may have done before, certainly not as frequently, I believe. And actually, for many of our children, they have also faced changes in the home dynamics as well. This could perhaps be in relation to caregivers and parents' working patterns, for example. It could be in relation to heightened levels of stress within the home, heightened levels of anxiety, perhaps pressures on finances, stuff like that. And this is all on top of kids just being kids, and the fact that our kids have very busy lives, very busy minds, a lot to take on. The world's a very big place for a child, and they are actually in a stage of life where they are developing, they are learning who they are themselves, who other people are, and what their world is. So I believe this has been a really chaotic and stressful time for our children. And actually, let's not overlook the fact that many children out there are in extremely vulnerable positions. We don't like to look at it as a society, but the fact is, many children have lived through this period in abusive situations, abusive homes, poverty, neglect, really challenging situations. There are children out there with disabilities and mental health difficulties and emotional difficulties who would have largely been relying on them important social networks and social places that do massively contribute to their well-being. I certainly know from my experience of working with children in the care system just how important social centres and social networks are for them. So not only have our children experienced this chaos and this turmoil, but this has been alongside a very immediate and very frequently presented idea of a virus. And of course, this idea of a virus has been attached to so many different associations, some of which being danger, threat, risk, illness, death, their world being unsafe, themselves being dirty, perhaps, in relation to the sanitisation, other people being unsafe, being close to others being unsafe, hugging, kissing, physical contact, sharing, playing, talking openly, breathing openly in social places, singing, all these very natural behaviours, and certainly for children very instinctive and free and creative behaviours, have all been associated in relation to this idea of a virus as unsafe, as not okay, and certainly not until certain rules and conditions and restrictions have been placed upon them. And that's an important point to make, actually, in terms of the social settings I was talking about, because of course now we have seen the reintroduction of the school for children and other openings of other social settings. However, these themselves have come with a whole load of attached conditions and restrictions and rules upon how children behave in these social situations, how far they actually do socialise with others, and what they have to do to be safe in them social situations. So for me, this this in its very self adds all sorts of complexities to the stress our children are continuing to experience. So these ideas of fear then continually presented to our children. I've spoken before about the developmental impact I believe these measures are having, on a previous video. And I've also spoken about the fact that the ideas that are absorbed by our children throughout childhood, certainly in the earlier years, they are contributing to what are known as core beliefs. The very ideas, the very ways of thinking in relation to themselves, to other people, to the world around them, these are ingrained ideas that they are going to have for the rest of their lives, potentially, that provide the basis for everything they become as people, that take them right throughout adulthood. So the nature of the messages that are being taken in and the experiences our children are having at this time cannot be underestimated. It cannot be overlooked. Please do start to consider the messages that your child is intaking right now, as a parent, as a caregiver, as anyone working with children. The fact is that this has affected and is continuing to affect all of our children at this time, and they are being exposed to these ideas of threat and fear on such a wide level now. You can't take your child into any social situation now without them being presented with faceless individuals around them, without them seeing symbols of the facial coverings and the rules everywhere they go in, and of course the modification of people's behaviours. Our children are taking all this in, on top of the conversations they're hearing, on top of the messages they're receiving through school or through the news, everything they're exposed to, really. And actually, I just want to talk briefly about the concept of fear on a neurological level. So there's part of our brain then called the amygdala, and it's quite commonly referred to as the fear centre. This is the part of our brains which interpret any threat from our environment, from our experiences. And what happens then is this part of the brain, when it's alerted to threat, and I have to point out that this can be threat that we are consciously aware of, for example fire, that we would see that as something to be wary of straight away. We'd be conscious of that threat. But our minds can also receive threats on a subliminal level, so we may not be consciously aware that there is a threat, yet our minds are perceiving potential threats from around us, which is really quite interesting, I think, in relation to considering what your mind may be taking in, what our minds may be taking in, even on a subconscious level at this time, certainly in relation to fear. So what happens then is when the amygdala is activated, it releases stress hormones in the body, adrenaline and cortisol. And what happens is the physical body is placed in preparation for dealing with a threat. It's where the term the fight and flight response kicks in. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with that. It's when our heart rate is increased, our blood pressure is elevated, we experience heightened levels of energy and go into quite a hyperactive state. So I do think it's interesting, and I would appreciate any feedback on this if you may have seen this potentially in your child during this period. I've heard from quite a lot of parents over the months who have told me of their experiences with their own children, showing certain levels of anxiety and emotional distress and challenging behaviour. And I do believe that this potentially is all linked to the fact that our children may well have activated fear response in them at this time, which is really quite concerning for me, you know, because research shows us that actually for children who do experience an overactive amygdala, so of course this, you know, the amygdala, this response in our brains, it's very self-preserving, it's very protective, and of course it's great, it's very useful in life. However, when it's overactive, certainly in childhood, so for example for children who have experienced trauma and significant traumatic experiences, in when this amygdala has been activated on a prolonged for a prolonged amount of time or on a recurrent basis, so quite frequently throughout childhood, this is actually linked to a range of mental health difficulties and physical health difficulties later in life. And actually research shows that it's also linked with shorter life expectancy. And what actually happens as well is when the fear response is activated in us, our judgment, our logical thinking, our behaviour can be massively impaired. So I believe, you know, potentially our children have been placed in states of fear and certainly levels of perceived risk and threat and everything being unsafe over this period of time. And for that very reason, I'm in the position of saying there must be a better way forward than this. There must be better ways than the ways that people are behaving at the minute. The measures that are being enforced, that have been enforced for the past 8 months, that actually there's very little evidence out there to suggest that they're helping anybody, certainly anybody's mental health. There are certainly better ways forward than this, guys. Mental health has been totally disregarded throughout this, not only in relation to our children, but those who do experience mental health, our adults, our young adults, our elderly. There are yet to be any statistics released on suicides this year, which I do find quite concerning. So we're yet to see the extent really, and the long-term effects, the quite devastating effects of certainly elevated levels of mental illness in our society, I believe. And you only need to look at the absolutely horrendous experiences that people have gone through during this time as well. The elderly being shut away and kept from loved ones as they have done, people who have lost relatives during this time, where perhaps their medical needs weren't met or weren't actively attended to due to the fear and measures in place in relation to CV. The women who have gone through childbirth or, you know, difficulties in pregnancy without their partners being allowed to be present, the people who have had their businesses crumble and who are facing anxiety every single day about the risk of that happening. There are so many people who have suffered during this time, and arguably I believe that the suffering that we are not told about far outweighs the risk of the virus. I do believe personally, and this is based on research I've done myself, you know, this isn't me pushing out some conspiracy theory here, and it certainly isn't me imposing my beliefs. This is just my perspective, and actually I can stand quite firmly in saying I've done the research which suggests to me that certainly the risk that is being presented is not what it is when you actually look at the figures and the details into it. So please, for anybody out there you don't have to be qualified to do your own research. Go on the NHS website, the World Health Organization website, the government website, the ONS website, the Office for National Statistics. It's all in there. It's all reputable sources of information which you are receiving these measures from anyway. So check out the details, please. But my point is, there must be better ways forward. This isn't a case of caring or not. I think we can firmly say that we all care about one another, that we all love one another, and we all want everyone to be okay. In our very human nature, it's our very human essence to be this way, to be kind and compassionate and caring. However, that by its very nature and its very beauty is not associated naturally with rules, with restrictions, with conditions, with threat, with fear. It's just not. The two don't match. And actually, if you look at what comes with these measures in terms of the suppression of people's free choice and free will, in terms of the absolute stripping away of joyful elements of life, such as human interaction, socialization, laughing, singing, dancing, listening to music, it's not good. These measures are stripping away that, they're taking away goodness for the what's being presented as caring for others and protecting others. Well, how is it protecting others when it's causing so much detriment to so many? There are ways of looking after one another and certainly protecting those who are at risk of illness. Of course, there is these measures to take on an individual and a collective basis on that. And I'd be more than willing to contribute to that, as I'm sure many of us out there will. But for me, it's at a point now where I no longer accept people sort of going along with these measures, not out of fear of illness, because I respect that if you are at risk yourself, or you do genuinely have fear of getting ill or your loved ones getting ill. I respect that completely. I understand that fear and I empathise with that. However, the fear attached to breaking out of conformity, breaking the rules because you're scared of a fine, or scared of losing your job, or scared of someone confronting you in a supermarket, I no longer believe that that is acceptable in relation to the destruction that is causing to so many, and to actually our children's mental health, our children's development, our children's future. It's not acceptable to be collectively contributing to behaviours in this way just because you feel you don't have a choice. You do have a choice. You always have a choice. And actually, once you start going with what feels okay with you and what you actually do agree with, rather than what you don't agree with but what you're told to do either way, once you start being true to yourself, you'll find that everything is okay anyway, and them fears that you have will subside, I promise you. But if you do want to talk about rules and laws and obligations, moral obligations, it is every single one of our responsibility to be safeguarding our vulnerable and to be safeguarding our children. And actually at this time, I believe it's quite evident that there are safeguarding issues going on in relation to these measures. So I hope we do start coming together. I have faith that we do start coming together more collectively and moving forward in a better way, a positive way, a brighter way, a way which looks after everybody, a way that takes into consideration the vulnerable throughout this. So I guess let's start looking forward to living our lives freely, living our lives where we can smile and talk and laugh with one another and share and exchange in a supermarket, and our children to be able to look up at the adults surrounding them, these people they look up to, and have them smile at them, and then being able to see the emotion on our faces, really. So yeah, better ways forward. Check out the Great Barrington Declaration and the World Health Alliance. These are examples of proposals from experts, from a huge collection of experts in medicine, in science, in general well-being, in holistic health, in looking forward in a progressive way to providing more safer and holistically focused ways forward to reach resolution. Thank you to anybody who has watched this video today, who's watched my previous video, and if you haven't already, please join the group on Facebook if this resonates. I'm very privileged at this time to also be part of a group of mental health professionals and psychologists coming together at this time to look at ways forward in considering mental health and providing some healing, I guess. So yeah, watch out for that. And yep, thank you very much, guys. I hope this has resonated. I hope you have a great week.